I was standing at the tactical display when Lieutenant Owen Garrett pulled it from the deep space relay buffer. He did not say anything at first. He just turned and looked at me with that expression officers get when the numbers on the screen stop making sense. I walked over and read it myself. Then I read it again. Kareth Station was gone. Not damaged, not under siege. Gone. The automated beacon had fired once, burned for 6 seconds, and then cut out the way a candle cuts out when you hold it underwater. Whatever had happened there, it had happened fast, and whatever was left of that station was not transmitting anymore. I am Commander Vera Osi of the United Earth Federation warship Unyielding Resolve, and I have been in deep space long enough to know that silence from a joint Allied outpost is never good news. Kareth Station held 412 personnel, Sarathi engineers, human technicians, a small Drethian observation team. All of them had been living on that station for 3 years, sharing meals and maintenance shifts, and the particular boredom that comes with manning an outpost on the edge of contested space. 412 people, 6 seconds of signal, then nothing. Owen pulled the surrounding scan data. The Vorkai fleet signatures were everywhere in that sector, dense and overlapping like a swarm of something that had no intention of leaving. I had studied the Vorkai in officer training. Everyone had. They were old, and they were patient, and they consumed what they found. They did not negotiate. They did not retreat. They picked a world, or a station, or a fleet, and they pressed until there was nothing left to press against. For 3 years, they had been pressing against the Sarathi Dominion. The Sarathi were an insectoid species. 4 billion individuals spread across 11 colony worlds and one jewel of a homeworld called Sarathi Prime. They were proud and precise and extraordinarily good at the kind of defensive engineering that could hold a siege line for months. They had held for 3 years. But Kareth Station going dark meant their outer perimeter had collapsed, and a collapsed outer perimeter meant the Vorkai were now inside the defensive shell. I sent the report up to Admiral Grace Holloway aboard the carrier Enduring Cause. She had it within 4 minutes. Within the hour, she had passed it to the Federation High Command on Earth. The debate that followed lasted 11 hours. I know because I was awake for all of it, watching the secure channel feed from the bridge while my crew moved quietly around me, pretending to run routine diagnostics and not pretending very well. Everyone knew what was happening. Everyone knew what the vote meant either way. The Sarathi ambassador, a large and ancient female they called Chitin Mother Azek, had been petitioning the Federation for 2 years. She had presented population projections, territorial maps, detailed recordings of Vorkai siege patterns. She had stood before the High Council and said, in the flat translated tones of a species that did not beg easily, that her people were being consumed world by world, and that the mathematics of the situation were simple. When the Sarathi were gone, the Vorkai would not stop. They never stopped. They would keep moving until something stopped them, and the only thing in their current path that had the capability to do that was humanity. She had said, they eat our worlds. They will eat yours next. The High Council had thanked her for her time and tabled the discussion for 2 years. Now Kareth Station was silent and 14 seats out of 16 were occupied by council members who had suddenly found new urgency in very old math. The vote came in at 0700 hours, 11-2, with 1 abstention. The Federation was going to war. I remember the exact moment the mobilization order hit the fleet network. I was standing with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Owen read the order aloud from his console, and the words fell into the bridge like stones into still water. Authorize full deployment of the 1st, 3rd, and 7th Combined Armadas. Engage Vorkai forces in defense of Allied territory. Rules of engagement. Protect civilian populations, defend Allied combatants, and respond to Vorkai aggression with appropriate and sustained force. Appropriate and sustained force. Someone in the legal department had worked hard on that sentence. What it meant, in practice, was 400 warships, 6,000 fighter craft, 3 carrier groups, each one a city in space, troop transports, medical frigates, supply chains stretching back 40 light years. And at the center of it all, one flagship, the Unyielding Resolve, carrying the combined command staff of the largest military deployment in human history since the Proxima conflict 12 years ago. I walked the flight deck during the final pre-jump checks. It took 40 minutes to walk the full length of it, and the whole time, crew members were moving around me in organized streams, running cables, loading ordnance bays, calling out system checks in a dozen accents from a dozen places back home. A young man from somewhere in the north of England was calibrating a targeting relay and singing quietly to himself. 2 women near the fighter bays were arguing cheerfully about the best approach vector into Sarathi space. A senior engineer named Calvin Marsh was on his hands and knees inside an open panel, making some last adjustment with the focused calm of a man who had done this 1,000 times and intended to do it 1,000 more. They were all so young. Not all of them, but enough. I looked at them and thought about Kareth Station. 412 people who had also been young, or middle-aged, or close to retirement, or somewhere in between. 412 people who had woken up one morning on an ordinary shift and been gone by the end of it. I did not let myself dwell on that. There was no room for it right now. At 1400 hours, Admiral Holloway gave the order to jump. The fold drives of 400 ships engaged in sequence, each one opening a tier in the fabric of ordinary space and pulling the ship through it like thread through a needle. I had made hundreds of jumps in my career. I had never made one with 400 ships around me. The sight of it, viewed from the bridge observation deck, was something I had no word for. The fleet did not disappear all at once. It vanished in waves, ship after ship winking out of existence in a rolling cascade of blue-white light that moved across the formation like a wave crossing water. And then we were the last ones, and then we were through, and the ordinary star field of human space was replaced by the dark and alien geometry of fold transit. 11 hours to Sarathi space. I went to my quarters and tried to sleep. I stared at the ceiling for 2 hours. I thought about the vote. 11-2. I thought about the 2 who voted against, and I understood them. I thought about the 11 who voted in favor, and I understood them too. I thought about Chetan Mother Azek standing before a council that had made her wait for 2 years, and I thought about the 412 people on Kareth Station who had not been given a vote on anything at all. At some point, without meaning to, I fell asleep. My communicator pulled me back at 4:30 hours. Owen's voice, calm, but with something underneath it that made me sit up before he finished his first sentence. Commander, you need to come to the bridge. We're coming out of fold in 6 minutes, and the long-range scan is already reading something ahead. I was on the bridge in 4 minutes. The tactical display was running the pre-emergence scan data, pulling in whatever the fold transit sensors could gather in the final minutes before we crossed back into normal space. The picture it was building was not the picture we had planned for. The formation densities were wrong. The thermal signatures were wrong. The debris field readings were wrong in ways that told a story, before we had even arrived to read it properly. I stood at that display and watched the picture sharpen with every passing second, and I thought about all the ways this could still turn out fine. I thought about them carefully. I held on to them. Then we came out of fold space, and the ways it could turn out fine went very quiet. Outside the viewports, in the cold light of a distant orange star, the Sarathi home system stretched before us, and what it was full of was not hope. It was full of wreckage. I leaned forward over that display and looked at the scale of it, and I felt something cold settle into my chest. Not fear. Something past fear. Something that comes when you understand, fully and without any remaining room for argument, that what you are looking at is very, very serious. The fleet held formation, 400 human warships, hanging in silence. Waiting for my order, I straightened up. I cleared my throat. I gave the order to advance. Whatever had happened here, we were going to find out. And whatever was still happening, we were going to finish it. That was the job. That was what 11 votes out of 16 meant, and what 400 ships meant, and what 6,000 fighter pilots and their very young faces meant. We had come a long way to leave without answers. I was not planning to leave without answers. The wreckage field began 40,000 kilometers out from Sarathi Prime, and it did not end for a long time. I had studied wreckage fields in training. There was a clinical way to look at them, a method of counting and measuring and cross-referencing debris signatures to build a tactical picture. You noted the distribution pattern. You noted the temperature of the fragments, which told you how long ago the event had occurred. You noted the types of material and matched them against known vessel classifications. You built a picture from pieces the way an investigator builds a case, one small fact at a time. I tried to do that. My training held for about 90 seconds. Then Owen said quietly, "That's a Sarathi carrier class. The Ethan configuration. They only built 4 of those, and the clinical method stopped working. The Ethan-class carriers were the pride of the Sarathi fleet. Each one had taken 6 years to build and had a crew of 8,000. They were designed around the Sarathi philosophy of defense, which held that the best protection for a world was a mobile fortress that could stand between that world and whatever came for it. They were not elegant ships. They were thick and layered and built to absorb enormous amounts of damage before they gave way. They had given way. 2 of them were here in pieces, and the pieces were large and numerous and spread across a volume of space that spoke to the violence of how they had ended. Owen pulled the serial identifiers from the hull fragment readings and matched them against the Sarathi Fleet Registry we had been given at mission briefing. He read the names aloud in a careful, neutral voice. Steadfast Chiton, Unbroken Shore, 4 years of construction each, crews of 8,000 each. Now they were geometry problems in the dark. The rest of the debris field was a similar story. Sarathi cruisers, destroyer-class vessels, a type of fast attack ship the Sarathi called a quill runner that I had seen in action during a joint training exercise 2 years ago. Quick and sharp, and very good at what it did. Now they were pieces of what they had been, tumbling slowly in the orbital gravity of the homeworld they had come here to protect. I kept my face steady. I kept my voice steady. I gave calm orders to the navigation team about approach vectors and formation maintenance. And all the while, some part of my mind was running the numbers and not liking what they came out to. This had not been a siege. A siege had a shape, a progression, a set of recognizable tactical stages. What I was looking at had been a route. The Sarathi fleet had come out to meet the Vorkai in open engagement, and the Vorkai had taken them apart. We found Chitin Mother Azek on the 11th ship we hailed. The vessel was called the Receding Tide. It was a Sarathi command frigate, mid-sized by their standards, and it was running on partial power with 3 of its 4 drive systems offline. When the communication channel opened and her image appeared on the main screen, I understood at once how long the last 3 years had been for her. She was old for her species. The chitinous plates that covered her upper body had faded from the deep amber I had seen in her official portraits to something closer to pale bone. Her large compound eyes were still sharp and active, moving across me and then across the tactical feed she was presumably receiving, reading information the way her species always did, fast and precise, and without any wasted moment. She had 11 ships left. 11 ships out of what had once been the 3rd largest military fleet in this sector of the galaxy. She said, through the translator. "You came," I said. "We came." There was a pause. The translator struggled with Sarathi emotional registers. What it rendered next was flat and factual in tone, but there was something in the way she held herself, something in the angle of her head that made the words land differently than they would have from a human speaker. She said, "You came and it does not matter. They are around the homeworld. I have 11 ships, you have 400, they have 800, and they have already broken everything we sent against them. You came, and it does not matter, and I am glad you came anyway." I looked at her for a moment. 800 Vorkai ships against 400 human ones, with the wreckage of an entire allied fleet already on the board. Those were not comfortable numbers. No one in the room was pretending they were comfortable numbers. I could hear the silence on the bridge behind me, the way you can hear a held breath. I said, "Let us see what the scan says before we draw conclusions." Lieutenant Owen Garrett was already working it. He had the deep scan array focused on the inner system, pulling data from every available sensor suite across the fleet. 400 ships all scanning at once could build a very detailed picture very quickly. The picture was already forming on the secondary tactical display to my right, and I watched it build piece by piece with the careful attention of someone who needs to understand every detail before they can decide what to do with it. The Vorkai fleet was there. The signatures were dense and close and clustered in the high orbital bands above Sarathi Prime in the pattern typical of a final phase siege formation. I had seen that pattern in briefing materials. It meant they were preparing for surface operations. It meant the shield grids on the planet below were the only thing standing between the Vorkai and 4 billion Sarathi civilians. And then the signatures began to do something unusual. Owen said, "Commander." I was already watching it. The Vorkai fleet signatures, all 800 of them, dense and sharp and unambiguous 3 minutes ago, were wavering. Not in the way signatures waver when ships begin to maneuver. Not in the way they waver when a fleet shifts formation or begins an attack run. This was different. This was the kind of wavering that came when a sensor array was having trouble locating something. When the object being tracked was doing something the sensors were not designed to account for. I said, "What am I looking at?" Owen's hands were moving across his console. "I'm not sure. The signature density is dropping. Drive emissions are changing. It looks like they're..." He stopped. He looked up from the console. "It looks like they're spooling fold drives." The bridge went very still. "Fold drives. You spooled fold drives when you were leaving. When you were done with what you had come to do, or when something had changed your mind about doing it." The Vorkai were not done. The Sarathi homeworld was right there, almost undefended, 4 billion people below a shield grid that had hours left at most. But the fold drives were spooling. I said, "All fleet, battle stations. Full weapons hot, nobody fires without my order." The acknowledgements came back in a wave. 400 ships going to full combat readiness. It happened fast, and it happened quietly, and the bridge crew did it with the precision of people who had trained for this moment 1,000 times in simulation, and were now doing it for real, without flinching. And the Vorkai signatures kept wavering, kept shrinking, Owen said, in a voice that was doing a very good job of staying level. Fold transit signatures. They're jumping. All of them? He looked at the display. He looked at me. And then they were gone. 800 Vorkai warships. A fleet that had taken apart the entire Sarathi military over 3 years. That had reduced a proud and ancient defense force to 11 damaged ships and a commander with tired eyes. 800 ships that had been one shield grid away from finishing the job they had come here to do. Gone. Not destroyed. Not driven off by anything we had fired, because we had not fired anything. Not defeated by the Sarathi, who did not have the ships left to defeat them. Just gone. The way a bad dream goes when morning arrives. Suddenly and without argument, and without leaving any clear trace of where it went. The tactical display showed empty space where 800 drive signatures had been. I stood at the center of my bridge and looked at that empty space for a long time. Behind me, nobody said anything. The silence had a texture to it. Something between disbelief and a very cautious, very uncertain beginning of relief. Nobody wanted to name what they were feeling yet. It seemed unwise to name it before we understood it. Chitin Mother Ozek's channel was still open. I turned back to the main screen. She was looking at her own tactical feed. The compound eyes moved slowly now. Not the fast reading of incoming data she had been doing before. She was looking at something that did not make immediate sense to her either. I said, "Are you seeing the same thing we're seeing?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Do you understand it?" There was a pause longer than the translator needed. She said, "No." "But I would like to, Commander. I would very much like to understand it." I looked at Owen. He looked back at me. Across the bridge, every face was turned toward the main screen or the tactical display or me, waiting. I thought about 800 ships that had been ready to end a civilization, and had instead pointed themselves at empty space and disappeared. Something had changed their minds. Something had frightened them. I needed to know what it was, not just for the tactical report, not just for the debrief with Admiral Holloway. I needed to know because we were sitting in the middle of their former siege formation, with 400 ships, and every answer we did not have was a danger we could not plan for. "Owen," I said, "I want a full debris sweep of the Vorkai formation zone, every fragment, every residual energy reading, every piece of data we can pull, and get me a channel to the Sarathi Science Directorate. Whoever they have left, whoever is still answering." "Yes, Commander." "And someone find me something warm to drink," I said. "Because I have a feeling this is going to take a while." It was going to take more than a while. I did not know that yet, but I was about to find out. We landed on Sarathi Prime 4 hours after the Vorkai fleet disappeared. I took a shuttle down with a small team. Owen Garrett came with me. So did our chief science officer, Dr. Nora Clifton, a quiet woman from somewhere in the English countryside who had the habit of going very still when she found something interesting, the way a cat goes still when it spots something moving in tall grass. I had learned over 2 years of working with her that the stiller she became, the more significant the finding usually was. I also brought senior engineer Calvin Marsh, because whatever we found down there might need hands that knew how to work with both human and alien technology systems. The shuttle broke through the upper cloud layer, and Sarathi Prime spread out below us. It was a beautiful world. That was the first thing you noticed, and it felt strange to notice it, given the context. But beauty does not stop being beauty, just because the situation around it is serious. Green-brown landmasses cut by wide river systems, an ocean the color of deep jade, cities that the Sarathi built in vertical clusters, layered structures that rose from the ground in organic curves, designed to look as though they had grown rather than been constructed. Some of those cities had taken damage. You could see it from the shuttle. The dark patches where the Vorkai had pushed through the shield grid in concentrated points and done what they had come to do. The damage was not total. Nothing had been leveled the way you might level a city in a ground war. The Vorkai method was different. They targeted infrastructure, power generation, water processing, transportation networks. They wanted to break a civilization's ability to function rather than its ability to exist. A civilization that could not function would eventually collapse on its own. It was patient work, and it was effective. And looking at those dark patches from the shuttle window, I felt something steady and cold in my chest. We set down outside what had been the main Vorkai siege line perimeter on the northern continent. I stepped off the shuttle and stopped. The siege camp was intact. I had expected ruins. I had expected scorched ground and broken equipment. and the wreckage of a military position that had been hastily or violently abandoned. What I found was a functioning military installation that had simply been turned off and walked away from. The prefabricated fortifications were still standing, every panel in place, every connection point secure. The weapon emplacements were powered down but structurally complete, their barrels pointed at the city they had been targeting. Not twisted or damaged, but simply dormant. Supply containers were stacked in organized rows, equipment cases were sealed and labeled. A set of heating units for field rations was still warm to the touch when Calvin Marsh pressed his hand against the side of one. "They left minutes before we arrived," he said, not dramatically, just stating what the data indicated, not hours. Minutes. Nork Clifton was moving through the camp with that stillness of hers, turning slowly, taking it in with the careful attention she gave to everything that mattered. She stopped at one of the equipment stations and crouched down to look at something. I walked over. It was a personal kit, the Vorkai equivalent of the small carry packs that soldiers everywhere use to keep essential items close. It was lying on the ground, as though someone had set it down with the intention of picking it up in a moment, and then never come back for it. Nora looked at it without touching it. Then she looked up at me. "Someone left in a hurry," she said. "Whatever the rest of the camp looks like, this person left in a hurry." I looked at the camp around us. Orderly, complete, turned off rather than destroyed. And this one small kit lying on the ground like a dropped thought. Two things happened at once, I said. There was an order to leave cleanly, and there was something else. Something that made at least some of them move faster than the order required. She nodded slowly. The stillness was setting in. We found the captured Vorkai unit in a Sarathi military holding facility 2 kilometers from the siege perimeter. I say unit because that was the closest word available. The Vorkai were not purely biological. They integrated machinery into themselves in ways that made it genuinely difficult, looking at one, to determine where the organism ended and the technology began. This one had been taken during a perimeter skirmish 3 weeks before our arrival, badly damaged in the process, and had been held since then by a Sarathi security team that was frankly as confused by its continued survival as I was. Cheatin' Mother Azek met me at the facility. She looked marginally better than she had on the communication screen, which is to say, she looked like someone who had slept for 4 hours after 3 years of not sleeping enough, which is a kind of better but a very specific and limited kind. She walked me into the holding chamber. The Vorkai unit was standing, if standing was the right word, in the center of the room, attached to a containment frame that the Sarathi engineers had built specifically for it. It was roughly humanoid in overall shape, but the similarities ended there. Plates of dark metal fused with organic material. Multiple sensory nodes where a face might be. Arms that ended not in hands but in clusters of tools and manipulators that could reconfigure themselves for different tasks. It watched me come in. The sensory nodes tracked my movement. There was something attentive about it that was unsettling in a way I could not immediately explain, and then I realized what it was. It was afraid. I had studied the Vorkai extensively. I had read every tactical analysis, every behavioral profile, every contact report the Federation had accumulated over the past 30 years. The word afraid did not appear in any of them. The Vorkai did not demonstrate fear responses. They had been documented enduring enormous losses in engagement after engagement without behavioral deviation. They pressed. They consumed. They did not stop. This one was afraid. The Sarathi xenobiologist on staff, a young female named something that translated approximately as first thinking of the Amber Tide, had been working with the captured unit using a translation matrix built from 30 years of fragmentary contact data. The translation was imperfect. A lot of it was guesswork backed by pattern analysis. But some things were coming through clearly. I stood in front of the containment frame, and I asked, through 3 layers of translation and interpolation, why the fleet had left. The answer came back slowly, word by reconstructed word, building on the display screen beside the xenobiologist workstation. I read it as it built. I read it 3 times. The builders of the meat ships arrived. We were given the memory of Keldar. We ran. The room was quiet. Kitten Mother Azek was very still beside me. Not Nora Clifton's still, which was the stillness of someone gathering information. Azek's stillness was the stillness of someone who had heard something they recognized. I said, "What is Kaldar?" The xenobiologist checked her translation matrix, ran the query through twice, looked at the output on her screen for a moment before she answered. It translates as closely as we can render it as a proper name, a designation for an event, possibly a place or a period of time. The grammatical structure the unit is using around it is consistent with how the Vorkai reference historical trauma. I looked at Azek. Her compound eyes had gone very still. The kind of still that was not the absence of thought but the presence of a great deal of it, all happening at once. I said quietly, "Ambassador, do you know what Kaldar is?" She did not answer immediately. She looked at me, and then at Owen, and then at the damaged Vorkai unit in its containment frame. And then she said something that the translator rendered in a flat, even tone that did nothing to carry the weight of what she was actually saying. She said, "I know the name, but I did not know until this moment what it pointed to. I did not know it pointed to you." Owen said, "To us?" Ajek turned and looked at him, then back at me. The compound eyes were doing something I had never seen Surathi eyes do before. They were moving slowly, not the rapid information-gathering scan of normal Surathi attention. Slow, careful the way you move when you are handling something fragile. Kaldar, she said, is not a place. It is not an event. It is a name that the Vorkai use for a fear. A memory of something they encountered a very long time ago. Something that faced them and did not retreat. Something that followed them. Something that they have never returned to confront. She paused. The translator rendered the silence accurately, which is to say it did not fill it. She said, "They ran from you, Commander. Not from your fleet. From the fact that you exist." I stood there in that room on an alien world, with a captured machine creature watching me from a containment frame and an ancient ambassador telling me that 800 warships had fled the system because of what I was. And I tried to find a sentence that fit the situation. I did not find one. Nora Clifton behind me had gone entirely still. We commandeered the intelligence vessel, Long Memory, from Admiral Holloway's staff pool, and put Nora Clifton in charge of the investigation. She requested Owen. She requested Calvin Marsh. She requested 4 additional science officers and 2 Sarathi xenohistorians, who had survived the siege with their research archives intact. I gave her everything she asked for. Then I sat down at the secondary briefing table and told her to show me what she found as she found it. It took 41 hours. The Galactic Historical Record was not a single archive. That was the first thing Nora explained, with the careful patience of someone who understood that context mattered, and that most people lacked it. Every spacefaring species maintained its own records. Some of those records overlapped. Some contradicted each other. A great deal had been lost to time, to catastrophe, to the simple fact that information stored across millennia had a tendency to degrade or disappear. But there were threads. There were always threads. The first one came from the Drethian continuity, a species that had been monitoring galactic affairs from a position of careful neutrality for approximately 12,000 years. They kept records the way some people kept every piece of paper they had ever touched, not out of any particular plan, but out of the belief that everything might eventually matter. Their archive had been shared with the Federation 8 years ago as part of a diplomatic information exchange, and most of it had been sitting in a database on Luna that nobody had found a compelling reason to search thoroughly until right now. Nora found a reference to Kaldar in a Drethian record dated, by cross-reference to stellar event markers, to approximately 8,000 years before the current period. The reference was brief. It appeared in a broader record of Vorkai expansion movements, which the Drethians had been tracking the way a careful observer tracks the movement of weather systems, not with the ability to stop them, but with the interest of someone who wants to know which way the wind is blowing. The Drethian record noted that a Vorkai expansion fleet had moved into a particular region of space 8,000 years ago. It noted that the Vorkai had not returned from that region. It noted that subsequent Vorkai behavior showed a marked and permanent avoidance of that region, and it recorded the Vorkai designation for the reason, Kaldar. It did not explain what Kaldar was. The Drethians had noted the behavior and filed the observation. The explanation had not been available to them. The second thread came from the Sarathi-owned Deep Archive, the part that Cheat Mother Azek had unlocked with a senior authorization code and handed to the Sarathi xenohistorians on Nora's team without explanation. Old Sarathi had a different grammatical structure than the modern form, and the translation took time, but what came out of it was a story, not a historical record, a story. The kind that gets passed down not in official archives, but in the oral traditions that older species maintained alongside their written records, in the understanding that some truths were better held in memory than in data. The story was about a small world, a blue-green world, third from a bright star, located in a region of space that had not yet been visited by any of the spacefaring species of that era. The Vorkai had gone there in the early period of their expansion, drawn by the warmth of the star and the chemical signatures of the atmosphere. They had found life, complex life, developed but not yet space-capable, organized into social structures but not yet with the technology to reach beyond their own sky. The Vorkai did what the Vorkai always did. They assessed. They planned. They began the process of systematic reduction that would eventually render the world available for their use. They expected no meaningful resistance. What they got was something they had no category for. Owen was the one who found Vorkai's own account of it. It was buried in a fragmented data cache recovered from the abandoned siege camp, the kind of background cultural storage that military systems carried as part of standard operating architecture, the equivalent of a civilization's ambient memory. The fragment was damaged and incomplete, but the pattern analysis software that Nora's team ran on it was able to reconstruct a significant portion of the content. The Vorkai recorded events in a way that was dense and economical, without the narrative framing that human historians tended to use. But the events themselves were plain. The inhabitants of the small blue world had not surrendered. The Vorkai had expected them to. Every species the Vorkai had encountered up to that point had eventually reached a rational calculation, a point where continued resistance cost more than it was worth, and the most logical path forward was submission. Different species reached that point at different speeds. Some took months, some took years. The Vorkai were patient. They could wait. The inhabitants of the blue world did not reach that point. They adapted instead. They looked at what was being done to them, and they changed their tools in response, not once but continuously. Every time the Vorkai found an approach that worked, they found a counter to it. Not through any particular genius, but through a kind of restless, relentless, practical problem-solving that the Vorkai had not encountered before. They could not match the Vorkai in scale. They did not have to. They made the cost of every advance high enough that the Vorkai began to recalculate. And this was the part that Nora read aloud in a voice that had gone very quiet, they followed. The Vorkai withdrew. Not a full retreat, not initially. A tactical repositioning, the kind they used when a situation required a different approach. They moved back to their fleet, and they reassessed. And when they moved again, the inhabitants of the blue world came after them. Not with a fleet. They did not have a fleet, with individual vessels, improvised and functional, and absolutely relentless. The Vorkai fleet moved. The vessels followed. The Vorkai fleet moved farther. The vessels followed farther. The distance grew and the pursuit continued anyway, across space that the inhabitants of the blue world had no mapped knowledge of, tracking the Vorkai by the residual signatures of their drives, following a trail through the dark with a patience that the Vorkai had always considered their own exclusive characteristic. The pursuit lasted, according to the fragmented data and the corroborating Drethian timeline, approximately 200 years. The Vorkai lost 40% of their fleet over those 200 years. Not in single large engagements but in accumulation, in the continuous pressure of an enemy that did not stop pressing, even when pressing seemed irrational, even when any sensible calculation said the cost was too high, even when survival would have been the obvious and reasonable choice. The inhabitants of the blue world did not appear to be making that calculation. They were making a different one. A calculation that the Vorkai, after 8,000 years of expansion and consumption, had never encountered. A calculation that did not end at the point where winning became unlikely. Eventually, the Vorkai stopped. Not because they had won, because continuing to engage was producing losses they could not absorb. They withdrew to their home region and they did not return to that part of space. They documented what they had found. They gave it a name. They passed the name down through their cultural memory with the weight of a warning, the way you might label something in your home that you do not want anyone to open again. Kaeldar. Owen pulled the stellar cartography. He ran the coordinates from the Vorkai fragmented data against current Federation star maps. He ran it twice, then a third time, then looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. An expression that did not have a simple name. He said, "Commander, the region the Vorkai withdrew from, the location of the small blue-green world, third from a G-type star." He turned the display toward me. "That's the solar system," he said. "That's Earth." The room went very quiet. I looked at the star map. I looked at the coordinates. I looked at Owen's face and at Nora's face and at the faces of the 4 additional science officers and the 2 Sarathi xenohistorians. I looked at the data on every screen in the room. I thought about the Vorkai fleet. 800 ships vanishing from the orbit of Sarathi Prime the moment 400 human warships dropped out of fold space. I thought about a word passed down through 8,000 years of alien cultural memory. A word that meant, in some translation that no algorithm could quite capture fully, something like, the ones who do not know when they have lost. I thought about the fact that nobody currently living on Earth knew any of this. Nobody in the Federation archive had known it. There was no human record of a 200-year pursuit through uncharted space. No ancestor's diary entry, no carved inscription, no preserved oral tradition that said, "We chased something once, a long time ago, and it never came back. We had done it and we had forgotten it and the universe had not." It was Nora who laughed first. A short, disbelieving sound that she clearly had not planned to make. Then one of the junior science officers, a young man named George Ashby, put his face in his hands and his shoulders started shaking. And then it spread. The way that kind of laughter spreads. Not because anything was funny exactly, but because the alternative was a kind of stunned silence that the human mind could only sustain for so long before it needed somewhere to go. I let it run for a moment. Then I said, "All right, let's talk about what this means." The laughter faded slowly, but the feeling underneath it did not. I had felt that feeling before, in smaller doses, at the end of a difficult operation when the last critical piece of information arrived and the picture suddenly made sense. The particular relief of understanding, of going from chaos to clarity. Usually that feeling was followed closely by the next set of problems. It was followed closely by the next set of problems. The tactical situation was unchanged. The Vorkai fleet had jumped, yes, but we had no confirmed destination and no certainty that they would not return. Sarathi Prime was in poor shape. The shield grids were operating at 31% capacity. The infrastructure damage was significant. 11 damaged Sarathi warships were not a credible defense force. And we were sitting in a system that had just been a siege zone, with 400 human ships that were now the only meaningful military presence between a homeworld of 4 billion people. And whatever came next. Spent 20 minutes with Admiral Holloway on Secure Channel. I gave her the summary. I watched her face move through the same sequence of responses I had moved through, and I gave her the time to do it, because she was going to need to brief the High Council. And the High Council was going to need to understand, not just the tactical situation, but the historical one. She said, "You're telling me we scared them off." I said, "We scared them off 8,000 years ago. Today we were the reminder." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does the ambassador know the full context?" "She knows some of it. I'm going to meet with her in an hour. Tell her everything. She deserves it, and we need her cooperation on what comes next." What came next was multifaceted and demanding and filled my schedule for the following weeks in ways that left very little time for reflection. But I made time for the meeting with Azek. Some things required time regardless of what else was pressing. We met on the surface, in a garden that had survived the siege almost untouched. Sarathi gardens were different from human ones. They were low and ground level, designed for a species whose natural orientation was horizontal rather than vertical, with wide flat plants and paths that curved in long arcs. There was a kind of quiet in it that had nothing to do with the absence of sound, because there were sounds, insects, wind, the distant work of reconstruction crews, and everything to do with the fact that the garden had been tended with intention and had absorbed that intention into its structure. We sat on flat stones that had been placed for the purpose, and I told Azek everything that the long memory investigation had found. All of it, in order, without softening the parts that were strange or the parts that were still uncertain. She listened without interrupting, which was typical of her. And I watched her compound eyes moving while I spoke, reading me the way her species read everything, carefully and completely. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Your people do not know this about themselves." I said, "No. There is no record in your own history, not that we've found. 8,000 years is a long time. We weren't spacefaring then. Whatever form the pursuit took, whatever vessels were used, they were not the kind that leave a record in the archives we currently have access to." She was quiet again. Around us the garden moved in a small wind that came off the mountains to the north. She said, "I watched you come into the system. 400 ships, I had 11. I believed, when I saw your fleet on the scan, that it would not be enough. That you had come, and it was a good thing that you had come, but that the mathematics were against you," I said. "The mathematics were against us." "Yes, and the Vorkai made the same calculation. They calculated the mathematics. And then they accessed 8,000 years of accumulated memory and they ran." She looked at me. The compound eyes were doing something I was learning to read. A particular set of angles that corresponded to what I thought of as her weighing expression. The look she had when she was measuring something before committing to a statement. She said, "I have been negotiating with your species for 2 years, Commander. I have sat in rooms with your council members and your military advisors and your diplomatic staff, and I have presented evidence and made arguments and waited for decisions that took longer than I had hoped. And I wondered, sometimes, whether you understood what was happening, whether the distance between what I was describing and what your people had experienced was too large." I said, "We understood. I know, she said. I know that now. But I wondered. She turned to look at the garden. There was a long-stemmed plant near her that had a flower at the top, small and pale and shaped like a closed hand. She looked at it for a moment. Your people did not come because you calculated that you would win, she said. The mathematics were against you and you came anyway. 11 votes out of 16, you told me. 11 to 2. 1 abstention. And the 2 who voted against, they were not wrong to vote against. The numbers didn't support it. No, she said, they were not wrong. But they did not win the vote. I looked at the garden. I thought about the bridge on the unyielding resolve, and Owen's face when he read out the mobilization order, and the young engineer from the north of England singing to himself during the pre-jump checks. I thought about 8,000 years ago, whenever and however it had happened, some group of human beings in vessels we had no record of, following a Vorkai fleet into uncharted space for 200 years. Not because the numbers supported it, because something in them did not stop. I said, I don't think we calculate the same way other species do. Azek said, no, you do not. And then in a tone the translator rendered as flat but which was not flat at all, I am glad you do not. The weeks that followed were full and difficult. The diplomatic corps arrived from Earth with Admiral Holloway's blessing and began the work of establishing what the Sarathi would need for reconstruction and what the Federation was prepared to provide. It was slow work, the kind that required patience and specificity and the willingness to sit through very long meetings. I attended most of them. Nora Clifton published her investigation findings through the Federation Scientific Network. The response was significant. Species across the region who had received the broadcast feeds of our arrival began transmitting inquiries, and in some cases requests. The Drithian continuity sent a formal message expressing what their diplomatic language rendered as profound respect and a desire to strengthen existing agreements. Several smaller species whose names I was still learning sent shorter messages that varied in content but shared a common thread, a recognition of something, a reassessment of something. Some of them used the Vorkai word, Keldar, transmitted back to us in alien alphabets across the distances between stars. The Vorkai fleet did not return. Our long-range sensors tracked them for 3 weeks. They were moving deep and fast, in the direction of their home territory, without any of the deceleration patterns that would suggest a return. Whether they would come back someday, whether the 8,000 years of accumulated fear was a permanent deterrent or simply a deferral, I could not say. That was a question for future commanders in future situations. What I could say was that Sarathi Prime was standing. 4 billion people were emerging from underground shelters and surface bunkers and secured lower city levels into the pale light of their sun, blinking, moving carefully at first and then with gathering speed, the way life moves when it remembers that it is allowed to. I watched some of that from a hilltop outside the nearest city, with Owen and Nora and Calvin Marsh, on the one afternoon in those weeks when I gave myself permission to not be in a meeting. The reconstruction crews were working in the distance. Somewhere below us, a Sarathi family was reoccupying a building they had fled months ago, and the sounds of that process carried up the hill in fragments, indistinct but present. Owen said, without preamble, "Do you think they'll put it in the history books?" I said, "Which part?" "The part where we scared off 800 ships without firing a single round." "Probably," I said. "Eventually, once the historians argue about it for long enough." Calvin Marsh, who had been quiet all afternoon, said, "My grandmother used to say that the most dangerous thing in the world was someone who didn't know they were supposed to lose." We thought about that for a while. Nora said she wasn't wrong. Below us the city was coming back to life. It was slow and it was partial and there was a long road ahead of it, but it was happening. I sat on that hilltop and thought about the report I was going to write for High Command. I had already drafted most of it in my head over the preceding days, filling in the factual sections, checking the tactical logs, making sure the timeline was accurate. Now I was working on the final paragraph, the summary assessment, the part where you put the meaning of what happened into language flat enough to travel up the chain of command without getting lost. I thought about what to write. I thought about it carefully. What I eventually filed said, in full, "The human armada arrived at Sarathi Prime at 0812 hours and found the Vorkai siege fleet in formation above the homeworld. The Vorkai fleet executed an unannounced fold transit departure within minutes of our arrival, leaving the field clear without engagement. Subsequent investigation indicates the departure was precipitated by historical context predating current conflict. The Allied homeworld is intact. Civilian population is confirmed present and beginning recovery operations. Recommend Federation commit to full reconstruction support and extended defensive presence in the system for a period of no less than 18 months. Additionally, recommend a formal review of all historical xenoarchive data for potential undocumented contact events, as at least one such event appears to have had consequences of significant ongoing strategic relevance. And then I added one more line, because I could not leave it out. Note for command consideration. We appear to have won a war that started 8,000 years ago, and that nobody currently alive knew we were fighting. Recommend we determine what else we may have set in motion before we are surprised by it. Respectfully submitted, Commander Vera Osi, UEF Unyielding Resolve. I hit send. I went and got coffee. Real coffee. The kind that Owen had managed to source from the supply chain through a series of trades I had not asked him to explain. I stood at the viewport in my quarters, and I drank it while it was still warm, looking out at the stars of the Sarathi system, at the orange light of the sun touching the edge of the planet below. Out there, somewhere in the deep dark between the stars, an 800-ship Vorkai fleet was running. Running from a name. Running from a memory 8,000 years old. Running from 400 human ships that had arrived at a siege zone and done nothing yet but exist. The Armada held the line behind me. 400 ships and all their young faces. The coffee was good. The stars did not move. I finished my cup and went back to work.